Okay, so we'll begin. Tonight's topic is about the origin of all the customs and traditions of all the various communities amongst the Jewish people. How is it that we've become in some ways different, even though we all belong to the same faith? We all believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we believe in the same Torah. Nevertheless, there are differences that have come about over the years. Last week's topic was a little bit similar, and it's logical that this one follows. Last week was about the various opinions, differences amongst the rabbis. How could there be debates? After all, we're talking about the same Torah. How could there be different opinions? Why doesn't everybody agree? Why doesn't everybody think alike? How about the halakha? How do we decide who the halakha is with, who to follow, especially when there's more than one opinion? That was last week. Now we're going to focus a little bit on how it all evolved concerning that which is tradition, not so much halakha, but we'll touch a little bit on halakha, but more about the customs, traditions, and differences. And there's quite a big variety of differences between the various edot, the various communities in Am Yisrael. So in order to understand this topic well, I need to give you a little bit of an introduction, a little bit of history, background. For a good number of years, Am Yisrael is all in one place, in Eretz Yisrael, whether it was during the First Temple era or the Second Temple era. A great number of Jews are in one place, and that's good. The closer they are together, hopefully, the more similar they will be. There's no reason to have differences between them if they're all in one place. However, unfortunately, we were dispersed, and various Jewish communities formed outside of the boundaries of Israel. We were expelled after the first Churban. We went to Babylonia. Now, Babylonia is close to Persia. So when I say Babylonia, I also mean Persia, because not all the Jews came back to rebuild the Second Temple. Some of the communities that formed in that part of Asia remained there. And there are some Jews in Iran, perhaps, whose family goes back for many, many, many years, even before the destruction of the Second Temple. They may have been there from before. And the same is true with other small communities that may have come about, even though on a small scale, in Teman, in Yemen, and this is prior to the destruction of the First Temple. But for the most part, during that era, most Jews are in Eretz Yisrael, and those that left came back, and even though not everybody came back, eventually many joined. The community in Eretz Yisrael, once it was fully established, that Bet HaMikdash was rebuilt, and that is where the Ikar, that is where the main Jewish community is during the Second Temple era in Eretz Yisrael. The trouble begins much after the Second Temple is destroyed, or Am Yisrael is dispersed all over the world. And that is where you begin to have communities in Europe, in North Africa, in almost every corner of the world. Little by little, the Jews are scattered, or they go on their own, which also there was quite a bit of an opportunity for many Jews to go on their own. And this even happened before the destruction of the Second Temple. You even have already a small community in Egypt. There's still a Bet HaMikdash, and there are already Jews outside of Eretz Yisrael. So there are Jews living on their own without being expelled. There are those who are being expelled. And then there are those who are already in Europe, having been expelled, who are being expelled again from country to country. In just almost every country in Europe expelled Jews. And then you have Jews staying in the same place, but being taken over by different nations. Spain was occupied by various nations, various peoples. You had Christians, you had Muslims, you had Christians again. So you have a variety of peoples influencing the Jews even in that one particular place. During this time, of course, initially, after the Churban of the Second Temple, the main yeshivot are in Bavel. You have, for a number of years, a couple hundred years, you have yeshivot, you have Talmidei Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael too, but a great deal of it is being transferred to Bavel. And for a long time, Bavel was a very important center of Torah for Am Yisrael. Nevertheless, what has happened so far, because of the Churban Bayit, Am Yisrael is being scattered everywhere. And initially, the way it went approximately, we don't know exactly who was first. We do know that initially there was a small community in Germany already. And some say that even Spain had a very small community right after the Churban, right before the Churban. Small communities, but eventually these countries, Spain, Germany, and France, is where the Jews moved to and settled. After that, because of problems, not because they were curious or not because they wanted, but usually because of problems, they moved. It was Portugal, it was Italy, Eastern Europe, North Africa, Turkey, and eventually other countries in Asia, including Uzbekistan, including Tajikistan, including just about any country you can think of, there were Jews, even India. Now, in some places in Asia, the reason why Jews went there is because of business. There was no yeshivot, there was nothing, there was no real Jewish community. It was strictly because of business. But once you move because of business, of course, you make routes. And that's why there have been Jews almost everywhere in almost every country, even though it was not a major community in the past, but people settled in different places for a variety of reasons. Syria, of course, was another place where the community grew and has been there for many, many years. Even before the Churban, there were Jews living there because it was close to Eretz Israel. We're talking about a time in our history that the Mishnah and the Gemara are pretty much composed, put together, and they not only represent the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition being written down, they also are the basis of our halakha today. We have a Shulchan Aruch, which is a composition that takes pretty much all the main halachot that we need to know how to practice Judaism today, because many of the mitzvot in the Torah do not apply today. We don't have a Bet HaMikdash, we don't have sacrifices. So the Shulchan Aruch puts together the main halachot that apply to us on a daily basis. So this is, of course, after the Mishnah and the Gemara are composed. And that is a very important point because, as I explained last week, once they were pretty much written, there were no alterations allowed. It was pretty much received as is. But as we will soon see, not everything was concluded. Even though the books are sealed and no changes are to be made, nothing is to be added, there was no clarity in all issues. Most issues were concluded, most issues were clarified, but there were certain things that were left without any conclusion. But this part of our history is very important because it codified the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral tradition. And in the same way like the Torah, the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Uktuvim, that we have, those things cannot be changed. What is happening during this time is also the composition of something called a Sidur. Right? We have the Torah, Nevi'im, Uktuvim, the prophets, which were sealed because there's no more prophecy. So that book called Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Uktuvim, the writings, the prophets, the Torah, that is completely sealed. That already happened in the beginning of the Second Temple era. Then we have, during this time, something called the Sidur, which also, by the way, includes the Haggadah of Pesach and various liturgical compositions that consist of prayers and songs for different times of the year. Sidur coming from the word organized. And this Sidur, Anshe Knesset Agdolah put together in the very beginning, a large group, assembly of rabbis, who put together or organized a book called a prayer book, a Sidur, which will allow Jews to pray. Especially after the Bet HaMikdash, where we don't have sacrifices, and when we don't have a Bet HaMikdash, the entire service that we have with Hashem involves prayer. So it's a very important part of a Jew's life is that prayer. So that prayer book is a very important composition. But during the time that it's being composed, it does not contain everything that we have today. It contains the basics. The basics is, of course, the Shema Israel, that every Jew is commanded to say, right, on a daily basis. It has the Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings. That initially they were 18, and now they're 19, because an additional one was added later on. Right? This was the basics. There were certain blessings that we say every morning that was put together then too. When first thing you get up in the morning, what you're supposed to say, to give thanks to Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Baruch Hashem, I've got up this morning. All the various blessings that we make before we eat, after we finish eating, all of these berachot and certain prayers that we have in the Siddur were already put together back then during the Second Temple era. So Jews were already praying. Prior to that, there was no Siddur. How did they pray? Each one went to his corner and put together some prayer on his own, whatever he can think of, in his own words. Because after all, there is an instruction, there is a mitzvah to pray to Hashem, to turn to Hashem. And that's what everybody would do at their time, in their words. But people were not very fluent, were not very articulate, and it was difficult for them to express themselves. So this was a big favor that Sheikh Nasser, of course, put together. Of course, Al Pi Ruach HaKodesh, they were divinely inspired. They knew exactly what we need to say, what our basic needs are of every human being, what we should say to Hashem, and they put that into the Siddur. But that Siddur was different than the Siddur we have today, as I will explain soon. But it was the basics. All of this is happening during the Second Temple era. Right after the Bet HaMikdash destroyed, we have the Gemara and the Mishnayot, major compositions that we have today in written form, including the Midrashim. And we have today something even more than they did, something which they did not have back then, that is the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah, eventually, with the printing of the Zohar, was something that, of course, was always kept private and not shared with the masses. Later on, even that was printed and little by little was taught. When the Ari, of course, taught it to his students, and eventually those students taught it to their students, it became more and more popular. So that's the Sodot HaTorah, the secrets of the Torah, or the mysticism part of Judaism. So Baruch Hashem, little by little, we have a great deal of the Torah being printed and being, of course, given over and being taught to future generations. In the meantime, as Am Yisrael is being dispersed, naturally, the dispersion is already causing certain changes. The Torah cannot be changed, right? So that's not changing. So what is changing? Small things are changing, whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not, as a result of our dispersion, of our geographical location, of where we are. Certain things are happening by themselves almost. And so I want to go over with you some of those minute changes. They're no big deal. And just show you how, even though we think everybody is so different in so many ways, most of those differences are really insignificant. They're very minor. The first obvious change that occurs as a result of the dispersion of Am Yisrael throughout the world is a physical change in appearance. You put me up over here against this wall. Somebody from Iran, from Russia, from Yemen, from America, from Europe, I'll tell you without speaking to them and hearing their voice or accent, just by looking at their face, where they're from. And I think some of you can do that too. As long as he was there for a number of years, right? Now, if you're really good, you can tell if somebody's from Isfahan and if somebody's from Hamadan. But that you have to be good. For that, you really have to be good. But there should be differences because they're many miles apart. And what do you think? I made this up? The Zohar talks about it. The Gemara mentions it. And I had a big argument with my ecology teacher about this in high school. He says, what are you talking about? You mean to say if I move to Japan, my kids are going to look like Japanese? I said, maybe not your kids, but your grandkids. Yeah. Overall, how do the Japanese or the Chinese look like they do? How did they become that? Hashem did not create all these colors and all these kinds of eyes and faces, right? The geography and the location where we live, the food that we eat, the climate that we experience, all of that, yesh lo ashpa, has an influence on facial appearances. And I can even tell if somebody's a Bukhari. Yeah. I've told people, I'm telling you, I've told people, Americans, you're 1/3 English, 1/3 German, and 1/3 Irish. He says, how did you know? He says, I can just tell you, you have it all in you, especially the Irish. Once you become familiar with the differences of what these people look like, then you can detect them. You can really see them. It's so obvious, it's so funny too. So anyway, don't think for a moment that the Jews look different because of assimilation and intermarriage. Chas v'shalom. Yes, unfortunately, there has been intermarriage, but they're gone. They disappeared. Those who have. How about the converts? They're not that many. The true converts. So when somebody has blonde hair, don't suspect that his mother or grandmother is from Scandinavia. In other words, not Jewish. Not necessarily. It depending on the climate. Red hair too. There's not one particular country actually that produces red hair. I'm still trying to figure out where it comes from. But there have been red hairs and blue eyes in all countries. It depends on various things. Genes, of course, have something to do with it. I'm not saying that, of course. Once it's in the genes, then it could be handed down to the next generation. But facial appearances, how the body looks, curly hair. You know who has curly hair? Most Ashkenazi Jews don't have curly hair. Not necessarily. Curly hair is a certain type of hair that is seen in certain groups, in certain countries, more than in others. Same thing with how dark the skin is. Yemenite Jews, I mean, they've been there since before the destruction of Beit Rishon, and they have not intermarried. They have not. Right? We know that they've been Jewish all along, and you can tell them right away. They actually look more like what Jews looked like in Eretz Yisrael when we were all there during the Temple era, because they have not moved. They've been there all the time. Obviously, they're darker because it's hot there, right? The climate is hot. So this is an important idea to keep in mind, that these differences are minute. They have to do with the geography, and because people live and are born where they are born and live, right? That's what they will look like. That's number one. Number two, the next difference that becomes apparent as a result of being in different places is the accent and the language. Languages, of course, Jews picked up the language of the place where they were. They did not necessarily take with them always their Lashon HaKodesh. If they did not practice it, they forgot it. Many Jews in various countries even had a Jewish form of the language being spoken. There's even a Jewish Farsi. And even in Farsi, there's different kinds of dialects between Yazd and other areas where you may not even understand them unless you get used to them. Different dialects of the same language. In linguistics, there's something called a dialect continuum. What's a dialect continuum? If you go to North Africa, okay, as an example, you will hear Arabic sound a little bit different in Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Same Arabic, but you will hear it sound different, different words. But the closer you get to the border of the next country, the easier it becomes. It's called a dialect continuum. In other words, the dialect changes moderately as you move on, as you continue, as you get closer to the border of the next country. And this is true in many, many countries. It's true in India too, where they have many, many languages, where the languages resemble each other. But it depends how close you are to each other. The closer you live, the less problems you have in understanding each other. Okay? So all of these influences in the dialect, in the language, is happening to Jews in their own language, whether it's Yiddish, there's a more Germanic Yiddish, there's a more Hungarian Yiddish, there's a more Polish Yiddish. Yiddish being influenced by the countries where the Jews live, all having the same base, Old German, but being influenced and retaining a different accent also depending on which area you're from. And of course, the further you move away, the accent and the vocabulary changes. This is happening not only in Europe, this is happening also in the Sephardic countries. As a result of all this influence on language, what you also have, which is a totally different topic, is an influence on the Lashon HaKodesh, on how we pray. You're going to hear Baruch Ato, and you're going to hear Burich Atu, and you're going to hear Baruch Ata. Right? You're going to hear all kinds of things these days in the various communities. And maybe, B'ezrat Hashem, one day I'll go over it with you and share with you which one is really the more accurate one. I said the more accurate, not necessarily the more correct. They're all fine. Hashem understands even Chinese. Right? Sure. And no matter how you speak, as long as you're sincere and you mean it from your heart, He'll understand you. Nevertheless, we do know that there is one that's more accurate, the one that's closest to the real thing. But what we need to know is that original one was corrupted, because language becomes corrupted. You go to the other side of the valley, when there is no communication like TV, radio, just go to the other side of a valley 10 miles away and people already talk differently. At least in the olden days, when the communication was not as strong as it is today. Today you can still hear the difference between a New York accent and a California accent. It's still strong, even if we have radio, even if we have communication, there's still a big difference in the accent. What do you say about English accent from England? Even stronger, you can even detect it more, right? Same language, and the accent is already different because of the distance. And of course, we cannot avoid it either. Even though Am Yisrael, Baruch Hashem, we're holding on to the Torah, we're holding on to our tradition, but there are certain things that are unavoidable. And one of them is the accent, Lashon HaKodesh. And it's a fascinating topic. I'll just give you one example, a quick example. The Vav in Hebrew is really W. W, it's not a Vav. The V sound is a bet without a dot. Vav is a W. Right? There are no two sounds alike in Hebrew, except perhaps for Sin and Samach. Every letter of the alphabet is different. And a V is a bet without a dot. A Vav is a W. The Yemenites say it like that. The Iraqis say it like that. Some Moroccans used to say it like that. For many, many years, that is what it was. But in Europe, the Ashkenazi Jews lost it because there's almost no language in Europe that has a W. And that is why when Europeans come to this country, they tell you, what do you want? They can't say, what do you want? Right? The W is difficult. Right? And in Farsi too, you don't have a W, you have a Vav. Right? Right? Understand? So I would not expect the W in the Lashon HaKodesh to have been retained in Iran. They don't have it. In every country, because of the language being spoken, there will be some influence, unfortunately, even on the Lashon HaKodesh, which is our language. Let's go to another difference now. Names. This one is very interesting too. There's first names and there's last names. We can spend a long time just talking about names, but I'm going to try to be brief. Let me give you one name, a first name, as an example, where there's 5 ways of saying the same thing in 5 different languages. Anybody ever hear of the name in Hebrew Yafa? Yafa. You know what Yafa means? Beautiful. In Yiddish it's called Sheina. In Arabic, Jamila. In Italian and in Portuguese, Bella. And in Spanish, Bonita. It's all the same thing because of where they lived and the language that they spoke. Now this is good. What's so good about it? At least they used a Jewish name and they just translated it, as opposed to taking a totally non-Jewish name. What does Patrick have to do with anything? Patrick? Eugene? And hopefully not Christopher. Right? Those are not Jewish names. Because in Farsi and in Arabic and in all the languages, there are names in those languages, but at least they're Jewish in origin. Even a name like Abdullah. You know what Abdullah means? Ovadia. Yeah, Oved Hashem. That's okay. right? That's perfectly okay. It depends, of course, if it has a Jewish origin or not. Now, sometimes, of course, Jews did adopt non-Jewish names because of the kavod, honor of giving for somebody who was very good to them, like Alexander. They adapted that name. It became a Jewish name. But other than that, Jews were always careful with their names. And if they wanted to use a name that was understood or common to that country, they would translate it from the Hebrew. There were nicknames too that Jews gave just to make it a little bit different, and you were able to identify that this was a Jewish name. Now let's talk a little bit about family names. A lot of people are curious about where did family names come from. Now you have to know that not every country had family names. For many, many years, family names were not even common in many countries. In Poland, I believe it was around 1820 that the governments in that area, White Russia, Poland, Lithuania, required the citizens to adopt a last name. So how do people know each other before then? It was Shemuel ben Yaakov. It was Ben. Now, Ben in Hebrew, you will find in all the languages also being used in some other way. In Bukhari, they used Of. Abraham Of, right? They used Of. In Gruzini, Shvili. And in Persian, anybody know? Huh? No. What did they add at the end? Either Zadeh or what else? Huh? Yan. Yes. Yes. They add a lot of names end like that. Son of. So in many languages we have that same ending, depending on the language, of course, it's different, because that is the traditional way of how people would call themselves. Now in Europe, however, they became very creative. And it's fascinating how the Ashkenazi Jews adopted family names based either on profession, where they came from, whose son, of course, they were, what they looked like, and what kind of people they were. For example, I'll just put together a few examples over here. Berkovich, Moshkovich, Abramovich, Davidovich, Wolfson. All of these endings are son of. So we have Berkovich, son of Dov. Ber is a Dov. Moshkovich, son of Moshe. Abramovich, son of Abraham. Davidovich, son of David. Wolfson, son of Wolf. Exactly. Then we have trees. Mandelbaum, Nussenbaum, Blumenfeld. All of these are nuts or flowers. Colors, Schwarz, Weiß, Brown. Yeah. Then you had professions. You had Lehrer, teacher, Milner, Fischer, fish, right? Schuster, the one who repairs shoes. Schechter, the one who slaughters meat. Schneider, a tailor. Schreiber, Zinger, Bronfman. You know what Bronfman means? One who distills whiskeys. You know, you had names of places where people came from: Hamburger, Ungar, Hungary, Deutsch, Germany. Various names that describe places or professions and the like. This is Ashkenazi Jews. What did the Sephardic Jews do who adapted last names? They, of course, either used Arabic or Persian or Hebrew. Gabbai. Gabbai of a Bet Knesset, right? Dabah. That's a shochet. Dahan, painter. Khazan, you know. Hajjaj, Haddad, Hayat. And in Farsi, Zargari, right? That's, he works with gold, right? Hamami, also, that took care of the bathhouse. I think that's in Arabic and in Farsi. Then you had Spanish names, Pinto, also to paint. Moreno, somebody who's dark skin. Then you had names of places, Barazani, especially for the Kurdish. Baghdadi, Yazdi, San'ani, Shirazi, Toledano. Anybody know where Toledano comes from? From Toledo, right? Some say the reason why they call it Toledano, we're not going back to Spain. Toledo, no. Yeah, That's what they say, כך אומרים, because they say we're not going back to Spain after they were expelled. Toledo, no. Yeah, could be. Ajami, Marciano, Gueta. Yeah, from all kinds of places and cities. Yeah, I have here a whole list, for those of you who like Persian names. Khakshuri, Zanjilbaf. Yeah, you know what these names mean? Yeah, all kinds of names that are based on what people did. And some of those names are common, some of them are not so common. But anyway, just to give you an idea of what people used to call themselves. By the way, you know what you call a Sephardi who became an Ashkenazi? Somebody who originally was from Spain and became an Ashkenazi, because some people moved to Eastern Europe, right? From Spain, they were expelled, they went there. Franco, Frank, because they came from Franco. So I think that's what they say, that this name comes from there. There's a lot of names that you will notice today that it's easy to tell they came from Spain. But here you have an Ashkenaz Jew that or his origin is Spain. How about the other way around? Somebody who's Sephardi, somebody who's Ashkenazi, who became a Sephardi, his name is Ashkenazi. You will see some, especially in the Syrian community, Ashkenazi. Ashkenazi? Yeah, because the family is originally from Ashkenaz, which is Germany. Possibly, that's where the name comes from. People, of course, adopted names of friends, of uncles, and all sorts of other reasons. But that's just a little bit of an idea of what the Galut did to us. The next area that was influenced is music. Yes?
So what about Levi and Kohan? How do you know what's the last name?
No, Levi'im and Kohanim usually have certain names that they went by. Some of them we don't know by looking at the name, but some of them we do. There's some abbreviations. For example, Segal, Sgan Levi, we know that they are from the Levi'im. Because of the Rashi Tevot, because of the abbreviation that they use. Shatz, for example, stands for Shaliach Tzibur, Chazan. So some people use an abbreviation. Yes?
So what you just said, Rabbi, when you gave the example about a Jew who goes to Japan in a few generations, he'll look like a Japanese
Right.
person. What about all the Jews now who come to Israel? What's going to happen to the grandchildren of these people? Are they all going to look the same now, Rabbi?
Baruch Hashem, yeah, they're all going to look more and more similar. You can tell an Israeli by looking at him, can't you? Especially if he's 3-4 generations there. I can even tell between somebody who's born in Yerushalayim and outside of Yerushalayim. Yeah, big difference. As long as he's been there 7 generations, many generations. A Yerushalmi, you can tell. Oh, yes, you could. Yeah, they're very, very unique. Yes? Even though America is a pretty big country, but when you compare it to somebody south of the border, they look quite different. Right? Now remember, here we're talking about races too. Right? We have an Anglo-Saxon versus somebody from south of the border that there may be a mix of Spanish and Indian blood, then it's easier to tell. But it's hard to tell. You know when it's hard to tell? When you look at somebody who is Spanish looking, but he was born here. That's very hard unless he's going to be here several generations. Somebody actually did a study of this. All the Jews that came over to this country from Europe, their skulls were a little bit more oval. Here, for the kids that were born here, the skull was a little bit more oval than in Europe. Europe was a little bit more square. It's a real study that was done of the differences in the geography of the place. So music is affected. How is music affected? In various ways. Not only the songs that Jews sing. Ashkenazi Jews, especially from Eastern Europe, are very much into marches. March. All the songs that you hear from Europe, have definitely influenced the Ashkenaz songs. It has influenced the tones of the prayer, and it has influenced the ta'amim on how one reads the Torah. The way the Sephardim read the Torah. the way the Ashkenazim read the Torah, the way the Yemenites read the Torah. I'm not talking about pronunciation now, just the tone and the sounds and how it's all affected by, of course, the place where they live and what they've picked up. Although I need to add, it has a Jewish taste. It's not exactly completely not Jewish in flavor, but they have adopted, they've been influenced. So people have asked me, what was the original music in Israel during the time of the Bet HaMikdash? That's a good question. We don't really know, but it's possibly, some people have suggested that it's very close to the Greek music. And the reason we know that is because of the instruments that were used then and that are used now in the Middle East. You know, they didn't have pianos, right? They had different kinds of instruments. So based on those instruments and the music that is there now in that area, it could be that it was similar to that. But outside of Israel, of course, there's no doubt that music also was influenced by the surroundings. So, of course, we have different kinds of songs, different kinds of tones because of that. Next difference that evolved is clothes. Even though the Jew, for many, many generations, was always identified by his clothes, you were able to tell who's Jewish and who's not Jewish by what he wore. People wore different things depending on which group they belonged to. Nevertheless, an Iraqi Jew's clothing was not the same as Moroccan Jew or Yemenite Jew, because the clothes is also something that people pick up from the place, because that place has a certain climate, has just certain materials that they use. And because of that, people who went to Europe saw something completely different than what they were used to in the Middle East. A vest. What's a vest? And a tie? These are European things. Now today, as you know, not all Jews have a Jewish garment. Everybody wears a tie and a suit, even the Prime Minister of Japan. It's become, the tie and a suit has become an international garment. Even though in Japan they still wear kimonos, even though there's still jalabiyas in the Middle East, even though there's still burqa and chador and all these things in the different countries, right? But the suit and the tie has become very much international. So it's a shame, because the Jew really should have stuck to his own clothes always. And there are certain groups within Jewry that insist on still wearing Jewish clothes, at least for Shabbat, at least. And if you don't have any Jewish clothes, at least the kippah, that's what differentiates us between us and the rest of the world. That's why the kippah is so much more important today than it was in the past, because it distinguishes us. So clothes is also something that is affected by where you live. Now, how about prayer? The prayer itself. We have various nuschaot, various versions. We had Sefarad. Even amongst the Ashkenazim, we have Nusach Ashkenaz, we have Nusach Sefarad, the Yemenites. How come we don't all have one Nusach? How does that come about? So I began to explain that during the Second Temple era, when the Anshe Knesset Agdolah, when the large assembly of rabbis put together the first Sidur, for the most part, everything was the same back then. There were some differences of opinion about certain words, perhaps. There were different versions of certain minute things, even then. But everybody pretty much had the same Sidur. The big changes occurred later on. And the reason why they occurred is as follows. The Sidur was not something completely sealed, like the Chumash and like the Gemara. It was a little bit more open. And in future generations, rabbis added their own compositions, either to add more praise to the Shabbat and the holidays, or because of some terrible tzarot, terrible persecutions that the Jews experienced, certain kinot and selichot was added, especially in Europe, as a result of all the pogroms. Various compositions were added to describe those terrible things that happened that we say during Asara B'Tevet, during Tisha B'Av, and the like. Things that were added because of the times later on. The rabbis, of course, had the power to do so. And then you also have certain nuschaot, certain versions of, or certain compositions that we don't know their origin. It was forgotten, simply forgotten. And because of that, some of them adapted it, and some of them did not adopt it, because they didn't know where it was from, or was it taken from, whether it was right to say it or not. So that's where you have the Italians having their own nusach, even though they're also called Sephardim. Because even though today we have all kinds of Sephardim, some of them have nothing to do with Sepharad, Sepharad meaning Spain. Persians have nothing to do with Spain, but they're also called Edot HaMizrach, Sephardim, and they pretty much go by one or the same nusach. Nevertheless, there are still some minute differences between Syrians and non-Syrians, right? And same thing with those that come from Spain and Portugal and those that did not. Some of them adopted certain versions and some of them did not, because not only they were in different places and different rabbis added different things, but not all of them were clear if something really needed to be added or not, because certain things were forgotten, their origin were forgotten. Then on top of that, you had the introduction of Kabbalah. Once Kabbalah came to the scene, things were added according to the kavanot of the Kabbalah. Kavanot meaning according to the ideas of the Kabbalah, according to the concepts of Kabbalah, and not everybody agreed to add that in either. So the Siddur was a little bit much more open, and today, of course, nobody adds anything to the Siddur, but you definitely can put together a prayer of your own in any language you want. At certain times, you can say anything. You can talk to Hashem more than 3 times a day, right? So the Siddur, because it was a little bit more open, it therefore evolved in additional compositions, plus some minute changes. But the main part of the Siddur, the Kriyat Shema, the Shemona Esrei, is pretty much the same. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, you have certain things that are different between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, again, because of either emphasizing certain things according to the Kabbalah, or because certain things that were added in those locations that were not added in Europe. What is happening is people are all over the place now, so there's no consensus, there's no agreement, and this is only a Siddur. It's not the Torah, it's not the Gemara. Yes? Some of them from Spain came to Iran too, sure, because Iran really has a larger community after the Second Temple, not from before. From before, they say some people remained there, from even before the Second Temple. But I'm assuming that the majority came later on, and some of them even came from Europe. Yeah. Just like the community in India, many of them came from Iraq. It was not that they settled there and they were there all the time. People moved a lot, and eventually you have a lot of people, for example, in Iran, on the border of Iraq, in the city of Kermanshah and Khorramshahr, that are originally from Iraq. Even Abba? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because it's a border town. So the people moved across the border, either on business or for whatever other reason. Now we've come to the more difficult part. Okay, these are small changes, but what about halakha? Halakha, hopefully we should have the same halakha. We have the same Gemara, we have the same Mishnah, we have the same Torah. So why are there certain halachot that are different between Sephardim and Ashkenazim and Temanim? There's 3 important points to keep in mind here. Once the Galut begins, you have what's called decentralized authority. That's the way that's how I'm calling it. We used to have a Sanhedrin, we used to have one body of rabbis making most decisions. We have the Tanaim and the Moraim, the era of rabbis right after the destruction of the Second Temple, codifying the Talmud. Of course, all of that is good. But after that, when everybody's dispersed and there's no Sanhedrin in one place, and there's less of an influence of Eretz Israel and Bavel even on the rest of the diaspora, so you have what's called a decentralized authority. And you have authority, bodies of authority, or rabbis, important rabbis all over, including Europe, who need to make decisions. Why do they need to make decisions? Because of what I said earlier. There are certain parts of the Talmud that were not concluded. There are certain halachot, certain areas in halacha that we have 2 opinions, and they remained like that. It was not necessarily ruled that this is the way it's going to be. So you have a period in time after the Talmud called the period of the Geonim, of the great sages who were for the most part in Babylonia, who did their best to organize everything. But still, there was room to argue, and there was room to elaborate further on something that was not enough elaborated before, plus new situations that came about that did not exist in the past, which I explained last week. There are always new things that come up. So in the very beginning, when things came up that were not clear in the Torah, they used certain rules to go by. They used, of course, their reasoning powers, and they were, Baruch Hashem, very gifted, and they were able to pretty much come to terms with the halakha. And if not, they went by the majority. That's easy. But now, there's no one body in one central location. Everybody's everywhere. You can't bring them all together to decide. So you're having different schools or different groups of rabbis deciding certain halachot based on this opinion and not necessarily the other opinion. And that is where you have the Rosh, the Rif, the Rambam. You have the various Rishonim, which the Shulchan Aruch, when he put together his Shulchan Aruch, he used them all. He looked them all at all to try to determine what the halakha should be. And they may not all agree sometimes. So he had to basically sometimes go by the majority. If that is their tradition which they received from their rabbis, or that is their conclusion that they arrived in, and the rabbis of their time in their location all agreed with them, and they were accepted by all of Am Yisrael, then when he put together the Shulchan Aruch, he basically gave their opinion a tremendous amount of weight. Came along Rabbi Moshe Isserles of the Ashkenazim rabbis and said, wait a minute, you forgot about our customs and our traditions from Germany. We had other rabbis, and we had Rashi, and we had Tosafot, and we had all these Ashkenaz rabbis who not necessarily agreed with everything, or they had a different tradition. So you have halachot that are coming about that are somewhat different in not too many areas, just a few areas. For the most part, the Shulchan Aruch is the same for everyone, but some halachot that are different as a result of various opinions that were never completely resolved, and that different schools or different rabbis adopted, each one based on whatever tradition they received from their rabbi. Then, of course, you have the actual customs and traditions that were later adopted in that particular location. The famous one is the Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom, right? That Rabbeinu Gershom decreed that no Ashkenaz Jew should take more than one wife at a time. That was European for the most part, not in the Middle East, right? That was localized. And then you had all sorts of takanot and minhagim. Ashkenazi Jews don't eat rice on Pesach. That was not so much a law, like the Chen of Rabbeinu Gershom. It was more a minhag. It was more of a custom. There was a little bit, I mean, it's still a law, it's still the halakha, but it evolved differently as a result of certain issues that came up at a certain time in our history. It was not a problem years ago. It became a problem, or it became a concern, I should say. Because of that concern, that rice may have maybe kernels of wheat or whatever the concern was, therefore they said, you know what, we're not going to have it. We cannot have it for 8 days. But the Persians said, oh no rice for Pesach? No, we can't live without rice for Pesach. So at least we're going to check it 3 times, right? So that's what I think most of the communities in Iran do. They realize it can be a concern, so they check the rice 3 times, right? Right, during Pesach, if you want to have rice, you check it. During a whole year, you may not have to check it, but during Pesach, I believe, most of them check it just to be sure that there's no problems. So you have different concerns, issues that come up in different communities as a result of where they are, the foods they eat, the problems that they have. And these are customs. These are small things that can occur, but they're not too many.
What about the custom of waiting 6 hours between milk and meat? Why did that change between different communities?
Okay, that's a very good question too. What about the custom of 6 hours? This is a little bit more of a complex issue, but it has to do with the Gemara. The source of this is the Gemara. After all, this is a real halakha. It's not a custom. But in the halakha, in the Gemara, it was not very clear 100% how much you had to wait. Everybody knew you had to wait. One rabbi even waited a whole day. If he ate meat today, he would not eat dairy till the following day. And it appears from another opinion that it was just in the same meal not to, but a little bit later on, after you had nothing in between your teeth, after the food was somewhat digested, you could have it. So 1 hour should be enough. And some figured, no, the difference between one meal and another, which is logical, is about 6 hours. And then some say, well, let's make a compromise. Let's make it 5, or let's make it 3. You see what I mean? So that's how they decided, based on something that was not 100% clear, but we knew there had to be some time. That's how that came about, pretty much. Yeah. You have another example, mitzvat yibum. Yibum is, let's say, Shimon is married to Leah. Shimon dies with no kids. There's a mitzvah from the Torah for Reuven to be meyabem, to take Shimon's wife. Usually a brother cannot marry his brother's wife. Right? If he died, they got divorced. But if there are no kids, he's not only allowed to, it's a mitzvah. Ashkenazi Jews stopped with that mitzvah because they said, if it's not done L'Shem Shamayim 100%, if he doesn't do it for the mitzvah, he just wants to, her for whatever other personal reason, it's better he give her a chalitza. Chalitza is a procedure where one releases her before she's allowed to marry somebody else from the street. She cannot go and marry before she at least gets a chalitza, which is a release. It's a procedure of getting a release from the potential Yabam, the brother who potentially can do Yibum. Sephardic Jews still did Yibum till recently. In Iran, in North Africa, in Teman for sure. Yibum was common. I think in Israel they don't do it anymore. They don't do it anymore. Even though you have Sephardim in Israel too, in Israel, the land Israel, the country of Israel, does not allow 2 marriages at once. Does not allow. I don't think they'd go ahead and do Yibum. I don't think so, unless it's something exceptional. So these are things that, because of a tradition, because of a concern, because of an opinion that was formulated later on by some rabbis, they decided, for whatever their reasons were, that we're not going to go ahead and do it. Another difference, another area of difference is hashkafa. Hashkafa is outlook. This one is a cute one. I like this one. Do you know that an Ashkenazi Jew, if he has a boy, will not name that boy after his father if his father is alive? And a Sephardi Jew, it will be the greatest kavod and the most beautiful thing for him to do, to give his son his father's name. Why? What's the difference between the two of them? This is my opinion. I haven't seen it anywhere, but I think it's psychological, philosophical, whatever you want to call it. To a Sephardi Jew, a grandson is like a son. I mean, to everyone, of course, a grandson is very special, but you better give him my name. I mean, that's my kavod. The father or the grandfather wants to do that. In other words, that's his continuation. I mean, how could you not think of that? He looks at it as a tremendous source of pride that his grandson will carry his name. Comes along the Ashkenaz Jew and he tells his son, how dare you? I'm still alive. You call him what you call me? What's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with that, because there's a halacha that if your father's in the room and there's somebody else with the same name, you have to be very tactful. You're not allowed to call your father using his name. You're supposed to call him Baba, right, in Farsi, or Abba, or Papa in Spanish, right? Father, Dad. You don't call him in Shimon, Shmuel, Yitzhak. You don't call him in his first name. It's disrespectful to call your father with his first name, right? Everybody agrees with that. That's the halacha. It's clear. It's not manners to do otherwise. So imagine calling your son your father's name. The Ashkenaz Jew looks at it the same way. What difference is it if I call my father that way or if I call my son with my dad's name? He's looking at it negatively. This is disrespectful to give my son my father's name. I'm calling my dad with his name. You see what I mean? So it's a different way of looking at things. Big deal. It's just hashkafa. So there's a difference between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim in this, but these are such minor things. It's not a big deal. There are areas of halacha or concerns according to the Kabbalah, I should say, ayn hara, evil eye, and all kinds of things where there's differences also between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, various concerns that they have, and also because of concerns and because of things that they may think are true and not necessarily true. Give you a quick example. Sephardim don't eat fish with milk, and it's too bad. You've never tasted cream cheese with lox. You don't know what you're missing. Ashkenazi Jews have cream cheese with lax. What they don't do is to not cook fish with milk. That you're not supposed to. That's not healthy. But apparently because of a quotation, a quote in the Bet Yosef about mixing fish and milk, because of that, they don't do it. Not everybody does. And if it's butter, I think it's okay. But only if it's real milk or dairy. And it could be that that quote is a mistake. It could be it was meant for fish and meat, which everybody agrees you don't eat together. Or it could be that it was just a precaution for not cooking fish with milk. Because cooking fish with milk, as they say, is not healthy. But to eat the two together, there's no other source that says it's a problem. Just because of that one quote or so, they stay away from that. So these are small differences that came about only recently, actually. It did not exist 1,000 years ago. Yes?
Would it stand to reason if it's not healthy to cook them together, it's not going to be healthy to eat them?
Yeah, but we don't have that tradition. It's not written anywhere. You should not eat them together. It says you should not eat fish and meat together, but not anything else.
So obviously that would be written. It would have it written.
Right, it would be written, sure. Especially if it was a health concern. The Rambam would talk about it. Okay, so what do we see so far? That the emunah, the faith of Am Yisrael is the same faith. We have the same Sefer Torah. Even though the Sefer Torah of the Sfaradim, Ashkenazim, and Temanim have a few letters that are different, it's just a spelling matter. The meaning of the words are still the same. So those few letters that are different do not make a big difference. And this is a very, very interesting thing because books can easily change, can easily lose the original, the text can be easily corrupted. Over the years when they copy, you can easily make mistakes. Just look at Sofrim today when they write a Sefer Torah or Mezuzah or Tefillin, they can make a mistake. If they don't check their work, they can make you can easily make a mistake. And if that mistake goes eventually, you know how many Sifrei Torah were never checked, or I should say were checked many times, and up until the computer checked them, everybody thought it was okay. Things weren't, unnoticed until it was scanned into a computer and the computer caught the omission, the mistake, the problem. So a human eye can easily make a mistake. So look at this beautiful Torah of ours that over the years has not changed whatsoever. You know why? Because that Torah, we always were very, very strict to hand it down accurately. That one we never tolerate. If it's one letter missing, it's pasul. Why? Because we will not tolerate a change to the Torah. So we have to be strict about it. So the Torah has not changed. Customs, yeah. Customs and traditions have evolved because of the galut, the diaspora. But the Torah has been the same. Just briefly, in case you're curious and want to know how many communities we have today in the world, we have like this. We have people called Yekes, because they come from Germany. We have Lithuanians, Polish, Hungarians, Romanians, Russians, Czech, Yemenites, Moroccans, North Africans, which includes Libyans and Algerians. We have Egyptians, we have Syrians, Iraqi, Persians, Indians, Bukharim, Gruzim. And then we have Yerushalmi, those who were born in Israel. We have all kinds of communities in the world, and they all have various differences, whether it is in the pronunciation, whether it is in certain customs or even certain halachot. But what did we say last week about Bet Hillel and Bet Shammai? Even though these two schools of thought fought bitterly about certain halachot, they did not prevent each one from marrying each other. Those differences did not prevent them from marrying each other. They still believed in living peacefully with each other, despite some of their differences, right? So same thing today. It's very important to keep in mind that even though there are some differences, they're minor, they should not keep us apart. We need to be unified. And if possible, what we're seeing today is also people should get married, even though this man or woman is not from necessarily the same background as he or she is. Now, however, having said that, you must realize that there are certain groups in Am Yisrael who are very strict about marrying only their type. Don't look down at them either. They're not being prejudiced here. They're not discriminating. They have a good reason to do so. Sometimes people are makpid on something called yehus. Yehus means lineage. They want to be sure that this man's grandparents are Jewish. All the way up, if possible, till Sinai. They don't want to take a chance, especially a Kohen. It's very sensitive. A Kohen cannot just marry anyone, right? So therefore, if some people want to marry from their own because it's just they're more comfortable with it or because of certain concerns, they're entitled to. However, people should not be too strict. People should be a little bit flexible. People should be understanding that that's what brings Am Yisrael together. It is a beautiful thing that is happening actually today, that people are marrying from different communities. And that's a good sign that Mashiach is coming. What I'd like to end with is with what the Chafetz Chaim said. Chafetz Chaim once was asked, how come there's so many different varieties of prayers and people pronounce things differently, pray differently? Basically the question that we were talking about today. Why should it be like that? So he said like this, why don't you go ask the Russian general why he needs the Air Force, why he needs infantry, why he needs the tanks. Well, why don't you just put everybody into the Air Force or into the tanks? Why do you need all kinds of weaponry and battalions? And the answer is, we need them all. Each one is doing a different job, and together they will defeat the Yetzer Hara. Together they will win the war. So the same thing the Chafetz Chaim says, what's the difference? That this one is like this and this one like this. We're all fighting one war, and we need everyone. We need them all together. Because if we are together, if we're unified, even though each one is doing something a little bit differently, this is how we will win the war. There's a need for everyone. Everybody accomplishes something as long as we have the same goal. And that is, of course, what the beracha, it's not a coincidence, this week is Parashat Vayechi. The blessing that Yaakov gives to Ephraim and Manasseh, or actually what Yaakov says, that the blessing that every Jewish father should give to his children is that may you be like Ephraim and Manasseh. Yisimcha Elohim ke'Ephraim v'chi Manasseh. Why should we, as parents, bless our kids to be like Ephraim and Manasseh? They are the only two that grew up in the diaspora of Mitzrayim and did not assimilate. We are growing up in the diaspora. We're growing up amongst Goyim. May our children be like Ephraim and Manasseh, that they should not intermarry, Chas v'Shalom. They should not assimilate. They should remain Jewish. That's a beautiful beracha. But in order for that to be true, we have to also be makpid on what our forefathers were makpid and were very strict. In Egypt, they were very strict not to change the language, not to change their Jewish name, not to change their clothes. As much as possible, maintain and preserve a Jewish identity. Jews should have their own language besides the language of the country. America is one of the only countries that I know of where many Jews only know English. In other countries, South America and in Europe, they know other languages. They know Hebrew, or at least more Hebrew than here. It's a shame. We have to put more of an emphasis on our language, on our clothes, on our name, on keeping a Jewish name. All of this prevents assimilation, prevents intermarriage. However, if a woman marries, then of course she adopts the customs of her husband. That, yes, even though she comes from a different community, when she marries, she adopts the custom of her husband. But other than that, people should hold on to whatever they have, to whatever tradition they have. In very few instances do we allow for changes. One of those instances is prayer. If you can pray with a better Hebrew, with a better pronunciation, you're entitled to do so. There are certain customs that one is allowed to refine and to improve. Otherwise, one has to be very careful to go by the custom of his forefathers. Minhag avotav, al titosh Torah timecha. Sometimes we are in a shul that is a different custom, so we go by minhag hamakom of the place. Other than that, other than the few exceptions, one has to hold on very, very strong to his tradition, because even though they're just small, minor traditions, customs, and halachot, they make a big difference. That's what holds us together. And of course, even though we have so many small differences, B'ezrat Hashem, when Mashiach comes, the prophet says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will choose for us one clear language. He will gather us from all the corners of the world. He will bring us, B'ezrat Hashem, the 10 lost tribes. And once again, very soon, we'll become one nation. Amen.